Welcome, today's story is full of drama. Like and subscribe to stay updated. Let's get started.
All rise. Divorce Court 132, Caldwell vs. Caldwell, is now in session. The Honorable Judge Taryn Bowl presiding. Please be seated. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I was sitting in a place I never thought I'd find myself. Separated from my wife of 22 years by a walkway with two long tables between us. My lawyer sat on one side, hers on the other, neither of them showing any real concern that a once-loving family was now on the brink of being torn apart by the process unfolding before us. I couldn't help but think back to just a few months ago when everything seemed so different. Our 22nd wedding anniversary was approaching, and being the romantic that I am, I was planning a surprise vow renewal ceremony in front of our family and friends. Little did I know I would be the one left surprised in the end. Before you ask, no, I didn't catch her cheating, though in some ways that might have been easier to deal with. That fact alone gives you an idea of just how bad things had become. But before I go into all of that, let me give you some background. I met my wife at work, of all places. I was an electronics engineer working on a project to develop a communication system that could instantly translate conversations for virtual meetings across the globe. This project was groundbreaking, with the potential to change the industry by allowing people who spoke different languages to hold boardroom discussions. The beauty of the system was its simplicity. Once you logged in and selected your language, whatever you said into the microphone would be analyzed, restructured for clarity, and then transmitted in the recipient's native tongue. Maya Lin was a multilingual translator my company, Silvertech Solutions, brought in to help solve a few of our technical issues pertaining to the perception of various accents. During our first meeting, I was immediately struck by her faultless beauty. She had long black hair that hung down just above her gorgeous behind. Her big brown eyes and flawless skin just seemed to accentuate her natural Korean characteristics. If it isn't obvious by now, I was smitten. Although I tried to be as friendly as possible, Maya seemed to be quite standoffish with me, always refusing any invitation I extended to get together after work. Even my suggestions for a quick cup of coffee or a meeting to discuss business during lunch were turned down. I eventually got the message that she just wasn't interested in me personally, and I reluctantly gave up trying to speak to her unless it was absolutely necessary. It was a few months later when she actually came looking for me. "Ethan, can I ask you a question?" She wanted to know. I came back with my standard answer to that question that technically she already had. Snickering at my dry sense of humor, she asked me why I seemed to be avoiding her. I thought about lying and saying that I didn't realize that was what I had been doing, but I believe in being honest with people whenever possible. I know it's not exactly a trait that will take you far in the business world, but that is just the way I am wired. Maya, when you first started here, I made every effort to be friendly, but you just didn't seem interested. I have since refined my contact with you to one of a strictly business basis, I explained. That was my fault. Why don't we try again? How about meeting me for lunch, and we can try to get to know each other a little better? She suggested. So that's what we did. I took her to a small Korean restaurant I knew, where the food was very authentic. She later told me that it reminded her very much of a place she used to frequent back home. That made me smile. To say we had a good time during lunch would have been a gross understatement. We laughed and joked throughout most of the meal. The only exception was when she explained having been through a bad breakup with her ex-boyfriend just before coming to work for us. Maya mentioned that was the reason she had shot down all of my previous attempts to befriend her. And like the gullible fool that I am, I believed her. Lunch together became a fairly regular affair after that. Sometimes we just ate in the employee break room, but often, we would sneak away to our now favorite place to have our own little taste of Korean cuisine and ambience. It was during this time frame when I finally worked up the courage to ask her out on a real date. Even though we seemed to be getting along rather well, I was still somewhat amazed when she accepted my invitation. I was so nervous on the night we went out that my hands actually shook. I took her to a nice steakhouse and a movie of her choosing. I was surprised when she picked a romance flick, and even more so when she reached for my hand and held it throughout most of the movie. Our first kiss came when I walked Maya to her apartment that evening, and I can still remember the sensuous taste of her lips as they pressed lightly against my own. After that night, our relationship really seemed to take off. People at work were surprised that someone as beautiful and refined as Maya would go for a socially inept, clumsy nerd like me. But hey, they say opposites attract, right? I know in my mind that I was very attracted to Maya, and she was giving every indication that the feeling was totally mutual. That itself should have been my warning sign. That itself should have been my warning sign. When she started inviting me inside for coffee after our dates, neither one of us being heavy drinkers, our simple kisses soon turned into pretty heavy make-out sessions on her couch. Maya always stopped the party before it got too intense, much to my own frustration and what I assumed at the time to hers as well. One evening, I arrived at Maya's apartment to pick her up, and instead of being dressed and ready to go, she met me at the door in an old, ratty robe and informed me that we couldn't see each other anymore. She tried to just shut the door again, but I blocked it with my shoulder and demanded a better explanation. She allowed me to come in, and immediately I could tell she had been crying. I now have to wonder if she wasn't sniffing onions to accomplish this task. Supposedly too worked up to speak, she simply handed me a letter she had received from the immigration department. It seems that since our project was nearly complete, her work visa was about to expire, and she would be forced to return to South Korea by the end of the following month. Why didn't you tell me about this sooner? I questioned. We were just so happy together that I didn't want to spoil things. I knew from the beginning that my time in this country was limited. That's the real reason that I didn't want to make too many friends while I was here. The more I got to know you, the harder that decision became to live by. Eventually, I just had to give in. Now I'm wishing that I had stuck to my original plan. I'm going to miss you so much, Ethan, she sobbed. We have other projects that could use someone with your skills. Isn't there some way you can get an extension on your visa? I asked. I've already looked into that. Unfortunately, the government has tightened the rules regulating visa extensions. I will just have to comply with their wishes and leave by the end of next month, she sadly explained. After wiping her eyes, Maya turned to me and asked if I would please just leave her alone from now on. She explained that we were far too close to each other as it was, and if we continued seeing one another, it would make it that much harder when she finally had to leave. Baby, why don't we just get married? Then you'll be able to get a green card and stay here forever, I suggested. Ethan, please understand. I appreciate the offer, but I need to get married for love. Not just so that I can remain in this country, she said through her tears. Maya, can you honestly look me in the eye and not be able to see that I am madly in love with you? I asked. Oh, Ethan. I love you too, she exclaimed, throwing her arms around me and burying her head in my shoulder. I know that a lot of American men will say or do anything just to get a woman into bed. I should have known that you were different, she said while smothering my mouth with kisses. I gently pulled away from her and getting down on one knee, asked Maya if she would do me the honor of becoming my wife. Do you really mean it? She asked, wiping her eyes. Honey, I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life, I replied, staring directly into her eyes. Then my answer is yes, Ethan. I will marry you, she said. Maya didn't put a stop to our makeout session this time, as we made love for the first time that night. To me, our coupling was the most sensual and romantic evening of my entire life. I would come to discover much later that Maya didn't exactly feel the same way. Neither of us were virgins that night, but I might as well have been. The only time prior that I had experienced sex was at a college party that one of the jocks had reluctantly invited me to as payment for helping him with his studies. I didn't realize that someone had spiked the punch with vodka and ended up pretty wasted that night. One of the party girls, who was just as intoxicated as I was, decided to bet her friend that she could seduce me. She ended up winning, though in reality it really wasn't much of a challenge to begin with. I was so drunk and excited at the time that I would have found the Bride of Frankenstein appealing. The next day, of course, she didn't want anything to do with me. Maya had never bothered to share with me the details of her prior sexual encounters, and being your typical insecure male, I never wanted to ask her about them to begin with. A person could probably run for president and have to deal with less red tape than it takes to get a green card these days. Maya and I did everything short of jumping on the immigration officer's desk and doing it right there in his office to prove that we were in love and not just faking so that she could stay in this country. To me, answering their questions seemed quite easy, as I was truly in love with Maya. I'm not sure how her evaluation went, but she must have been convincing enough because we were eventually given permission to marry, just 3 days shy of her scheduled return date. Boy, talk about cutting it close. Of course, the entire office knew that we had a date at the county registrar office to tie the knot 2 days later. While fighting with immigration, we had already had our blood test done and submitted all of the paperwork in hopes of winning the appeal. A few of the ladies insisted on throwing Maya a wedding shower. A couple of the guys got together and took me out on the town for a makeshift bachelor party. Despite their vigorous protest, I made sure not to drink too much that evening, as I wanted to be sharp and fully alert for my wedding the following afternoon. A couple of people at work stood up for us as we recited our vows to one another before catching a plane to the Bahamas for a 2-week honeymoon. To me, it was the greatest time of my life. Maya seemed happy as well, though looking back, it probably had more to do with getting her green card than actually being married to me. I had always wanted children, and Maya seemed to as well. After trying for over a year with no results, I suggested that we both get tested. Maya agreed to this but wanted to do it separately. We both had different doctors before we were married, and she wanted to keep it that way. My sperm count tested fine, but Maya told me that her doctor discovered that a childhood illness she encountered in South Korea made it difficult for her to conceive. I suggested that we get a second opinion, but Maya wouldn't hear of it. She did say that her doctor told her that pregnancy was still possible, though the odds of it happening weren't that great. Thankfully, we kept on trying. It was about 4 years into our marriage that a miracle seemed to happen, and Maya found herself carrying our first child. Elena was born 9 months later with all of the beautiful features of her Korean mother and my deep blue eyes. She was joined 16 months later by her younger brother, Caleb. We seemed so incredibly happy during that time that I still have trouble convincing myself that it was all for show. I had asked her doctor how Maya could have gotten pregnant so fast a second time after we had been trying for years with no success. Her doctor sort of gave me a funny look and said that sometimes these matters have a way of correcting themselves. Although I knew I should have questioned him further about the subject, I was just too damn happy to care at that moment. I was the proud papa of not 1 but 2 beautiful children, and my new family was going to be getting all the attention that I could possibly spare, short of getting myself fired from work. Maya became a stay-at-home mom, and although we had occasional arguments, as I'm sure every other family did, I was grateful every day for my loving wife and 2 wonderful children. The years seemed to have passed by rather quickly, and I was truly under the impression that Maya and I were still deeply in love. Our 22nd wedding anniversary was rapidly approaching, and I wanted to do something really special. My plan was to throw a surprise party for my wife, where we would be repeating our vows in front of everyone. I rented a large hall and enlisted the help of some of our friends to get everything ready without letting Maya know what was going on. Being the romantic nerd that I still was, I wanted to make a video documentary of our life together. I started gathering all of the pictures and video clips that we ever made during our vacations, holidays, special events, or just shots of us with the kids. I even asked our friends if they had any footage from my bachelor party or her wedding shower still lying around somewhere. My plan was to get something slightly embarrassing that we all could have a good laugh over. Now, I had gone through most of the footage and had picked out what I thought was the best of the bunch. My intention was to put some of it to music while other snippets had sound clips of what was being said at the time. So far, I had everything I needed except something embarrassing. I searched through the video that was made at my bachelor party, and because I hadn't let myself become intoxicated, nothing really seemed to fit the angle I was going for in my documentary. While going over some of her wedding shower footage, I picked out a few clips that could be used. Then, I noticed something odd. The woman shooting the video had set the camera down to go help one of the other ladies, but she left it recording the whole time. I could just barely make out the voices of Maya and her best friend, Nina, in the background. What I couldn't do was understand a word they were saying, as they were speaking in Korean. I imagined that they were probably sharing some girl talk. They say that curiosity killed the cat, and little did I know it was about to do the same to my marriage. I recorded their conversation to my computer, tweaked up the volume, and separated Maya and Nina's voices. Next, I ran their sentences through my company's translation program, and was stunned at what I heard. "I still can't believe that you are actually going to marry Ethan Caldwell of all people," Nina said. "Yeah, I know. I'm sick about it too. But if I want to stay in this country, I don't have any other choice," Maya replied. "Why in the world did you choose him?" Nina asked. "Oh, that's easy. I knew he had a crush on me from the way he would follow me around at work and ask me to lunch all the time. I always blew him off until I found out that they probably weren't going to renew my work visa. After that, there wasn't much time to find somebody decent, so I figured that he would have to do," Maya explained. "So you are actually going through with it?" Nina asked. "Yeah, I figure that we can stay married for a few years while I try to get my citizenship. After that, I can dump him for someone better," Maya laughed. "You could always have kids. That would keep you here," Nina suggested. "Are you nuts? I'm not having children with him. I had my doctor put me on this new once-a-month birth control. I figure that by the time Ethan realizes that there is a problem, I can come up with some excuse why I can't get pregnant," Maya said. "So how is he in bed?" Nina asked. Let's just say I'm glad I still have my toy collection. Maya replied as the two ladies burst out in laughter. That pretty much ended their conversation, as the other women returned to the room. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. Our whole marriage, hell, our entire relationship, had been one big fat lie. I could only assume that Maya had gotten pregnant by mistake and then decided to stay with me for the sake of the children. As you can probably imagine, I was heartbroken. After having a good cry, I had to figure out what to do next. I ended up calling a lawyer friend, who put me in contact with a good divorce attorney. After making an appointment that very afternoon, I copied all my files, including the ones I just discovered about Maya, to my laptop, went upstairs to pack my things, and headed for the attorney's office. I left a copy of the video and its translation on a USB drive, along with my wedding ring, on the kitchen table where Maya would be sure to see it. Luckily, she had planned to be out all afternoon shopping with the kids, so I didn't have to face her that night. My attorney suggested the usual splitting of the assets and canceling of our joint credit cards. He did mention that what Maya did was illegal and, if I wanted to pursue it, she could face jail time or, at the very least, deportation. I said that I would not do that to the mother of my children. When he asked how I knew that the kids were really mine, I looked him straight in the face and warned him not to even go there. The subject of paternity was never mentioned again. I used my parents as go-betweens with my kids, so I didn't have to face Maya. If she needed to talk to me, she could do it through my attorney, or if it involved the kids, my parents could always reach me. Maya tried to contact me directly many times, but I was screening all of my calls and not accepting any unless the caller ID showed they were from my parents, work, or my attorney. Maya's attorney requested a face-to-face meeting between the two of us. I flatly refused, stating that I already had 22 years of lies and didn't need any more. With the evidence I had against her, she really couldn't make too many demands. That pretty much takes us back to the beginning of this little saga. They say that there are two sides to every story. Now you know mine. Now let's hear the story from Maya's perspective. I never really had a close personal relationship with my family, so when the opportunity to attend college in the US came, I jumped on it. South Korea was very controlling, and if you had an opinion that wasn't shared by the powers that be, you had best keep it to yourself. It was so liberating to be able to speak my mind without having to worry about what was going to happen to me for doing so. It didn't take long for me to decide that this was where I wanted to stay. I got lucky after college and landed a job at Silvertech Solutions on a work visa. I was hired to help fix some syntax problems for a new translation software that they were developing. It was there that I met my husband, Ethan Caldwell. I could tell right away that Ethan had a crush on me, and although the guy seemed nice enough, he just wasn't my type. I avoided him like the plague, and after a while, he finally got the message and pretty much left me alone. My life was going great, until the immigration office caught up with me. My work visa was due to expire in 2 months, and no matter what I tried, I couldn't procure an extension. Not wanting to be forced to return to South Korea, I had to come up with some other method of staying in the States. When I talked to my friend Nina about it, she suggested that I find some guy to marry me. Yeah, right. I hadn't dated seriously in over a year and a half. Who in the world could I find that would actually propose that quickly? Then I thought of Ethan. I decided my most effective approach would be a gradual seduction. I didn't have a whole lot of time, but I just couldn't go and throw myself at the guy either. That would have looked too suspicious. I figured the best thing to do was to put him on the defensive. I strolled up to his cubicle one day and asked him why he had been avoiding me. Naturally, his response was that he didn't think I was interested in him. I lied and said that I had just gotten out of a bad relationship when we met, but I was over that now. I asked him to lunch, and of course he readily agreed. I let him take me to some Korean restaurant that he'd heard of, and I'll have to admit the food was pretty good. We talked about work mostly. No one would ever accuse Ethan of being suave, but he wasn't exactly boring either. From that day on, lunches became our thing. Sometimes we just stayed in the break room, but more often than not, we went out. I wanted our coworkers to see us together in case an immigration officer decided to ask them any questions about our relationship. After about 2 weeks of eating lunch together, Ethan finally got up the nerve to ask me for a real date. If the guy had waited any longer, I would have probably had to ask him out instead. I guess maybe I overdid it a bit when I was trying to get him to leave me alone before. I would have to remember that American men have very fragile egos. He took me to a steakhouse and then asked if I would pick out a movie for us to go see. I chose a romantic comedy in hopes of inspiring him to step it up a bit. 2 months wasn't much time, and he had practically wasted a third of it already. The flick wasn't all that great, but I made sure to hold his hand practically the entire way through it. We ended up sharing our first kiss that evening. I personally didn't think it was anything to write home about, but he seemed happy, and that was the important thing. Ethan really hadn't tried anything sexual with me yet, and I was beginning to think I had a virgin on my hands. If that were the case, it would certainly make my job easier. I changed my approach to playing the role of a charming and captivating good girl. I would keep him intrigued and eager, only to send him on his way without giving him what he wanted. I did this for weeks, always letting him go a little further each time but stopping our makeout sessions before any real sexual act could take place. We had a date set for Friday night, and I figured that this would be the perfect time to spring my big trap. Instead of being dressed when he arrived, I was in the rattiest-looking robe that I owned. I spent half the day practicing what I was going to say, and more importantly, how I was going to say it. I met him at the door with my eyes all red and puffy. It looked like I'd been crying, but in reality, it was just from rubbing my eyes really hard and overfilling them with eye drops. No, I had not been sniffing onions, but the results were pretty much the same. I told him that we were through, and when he demanded an explanation like I knew he would, I went into my story of how I was being deported. Looking back, I am ashamed to say that this was probably the most honest I had ever been with Ethan up to that point. I explained how I was over here on a work visa, which I'm sure that he already knew. I told him that I had already been turned down for an extension, which was true. I next declared that we should stop seeing each other, as it would be too hard on me to get any closer to him if I had to leave. Well, back to lying again. I could practically see the wheels of his mind turning at hyperspeed as he desperately tried to find some type of solution to my immigration problem. After I shot down all his other suggestions, he finally broached the subject of marriage. Of course, I couldn't agree to this right away, as I had to let him convince me of the idea. After declaring our love for each other, another lie on my part, I eventually let him have me that night. I could tell that he wasn't very experienced, and although he had a decent size, I can't say that I enjoyed our first time together all that much. In the end, I was thankful that I still had my toys. Even though I pretty much knew what to expect after researching the subject, dealing with immigration was still a giant pain in the butt. If there were a world record for navigating obstacles, our names would surely have been in the Guinness Book of Records by the time it was all said and done. Eventually, we must have passed their little test, because just days before my visa was about to expire, we finally got permission to marry. With no time to plan a wedding, we were just going to get hitched at the county registrar office, then go on a 2-week honeymoon to the Bahamas. My coworkers wanted to throw me a wedding shower. I personally would have rather declined, but they had all been pretty nice to me, and I did still have to keep up appearances. So I graciously accepted. Ethan's friends were taking him out the same night for a makeshift bachelor party. I had a bit too much to drink that night and didn't even think about the camera being on when I was talking to Nina. We had a fun time that night, and I drank a little more than I should have. I didn't even think about the camera being on when I was talking to Nina. We sat off to the side, away from the other women, catching up and gossiping. We started talking about my upcoming wedding, and that's when I made the biggest mistake of my life. I was tipsy, relaxed, and careless. I had no idea that my conversation with Nina was being recorded. I thought we would be safe from being overheard since we were speaking in Korean. I never counted on Ethan running our voices through a translator later. I know I said some horrible things. What's worse is I meant them. At least at the time I did. My goal was to stay married to Ethan long enough to establish myself as a citizen of this country. Then I would get a quick divorce and move on with my life. I never expected to develop feelings for him. I hid the fact that I was on birth control and let him believe that I really wanted to start a family. I was initially disappointed in our first night together, but during our honeymoon, he seemed to loosen up a bit, and our sex life really improved after that. We went on like that for 2 years. I could tell that Ethan really cared for me, but I just wouldn't let myself feel the same for him. I wasn't about to get hurt again. Then, something happened that changed everything. I got sick. At first, I thought it was just a cold, but it quickly turned into something much worse. I had pneumonia, and I had never been so sick in my life. Ethan was wonderful. He took time off work to stay home and take care of me. He made homemade soup. He gave me sponge baths with a cool cloth. He held my hand and comforted me when my fever got so bad that I was delirious. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night and overheard him praying for me. I had never heard anyone pray for me before. My parents never did that. They barely cared about me at all. It was in that moment that I realized I loved him. I had been pushing him away for so long, afraid to let myself love him, afraid to get hurt, but Ethan had always been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it, even when I had been lying to him. I had spent so many years looking at my marriage as a business arrangement, but now, I couldn't imagine my life without Ethan. I stopped taking birth control. I wanted to give him the family he had always dreamed of. And when I found out I was pregnant, he was overjoyed. He was so excited, so happy, that he cried. For the first time, I felt like I was doing something right. And for the first time, I felt truly loved. Ethan adored me, and now I adored him too. I was still afraid to tell him the truth. I wanted to believe that what we had now was real, that we could move forward without ever looking back, that the past didn't matter anymore, that I could just pretend it never happened. For years, everything was perfect. Our daughter, Elena, was born, and Ethan was the most devoted father I had ever seen. 16 months later, Caleb was born, and our little family was complete. I thought I had finally escaped my past. I thought I had built something real. But then, it all came crashing down. One Saturday afternoon, I took the kids shopping. When we got home, I had a strange feeling that something was wrong. Ethan's car wasn't in the driveway, even though he was supposed to be home hours ago. I walked inside and saw his wedding ring sitting on the kitchen table next to a USB drive. My stomach dropped. I knew. The man never took off his wedding ring. I sent the kids upstairs to play and took the USB drive into the den. When I saw what was on the screen, I nearly threw up. I had no idea that my conversation with Nina had been recorded. Ethan had the English translation on the screen as well. There was no doubt he knew everything. I sat on the couch and sobbed for over an hour. I knew my marriage was over. How could he ever believe anything I said to him now? After finding out our entire 22 years together was built on a lie, I tried calling him, no answer. I tried texting him, no reply. His parents called me that night. They said that if the kids needed anything, I could contact them and they would get the message to Ethan. I begged them to let me talk to him. They said he was refusing to speak to me. They didn't know why. He wouldn't tell them what happened. Only that we would most likely be getting a divorce. His mother asked me if there had been infidelity in the marriage. I swore to her that wasn't the case. And it wasn't. But I could hear the disappointment in her voice. The next day, I met with Ethan's parents. I left the kids with a friend because I didn't want them to see me fall apart. I told them the truth, including the fact that I was deeply in love with Ethan, even though I hadn't been at the time we got married. They were angry at me, but I think they also saw how someone in my situation could be tempted to do anything to escape deportation. No matter what I tried, Ethan refused to have any personal contact with me. He never neglected the children, but he used his parents as intermediaries. If I needed to talk to him, it had to be through his lawyer. Then, one night, an officer of the court showed up at my door and handed me a stack of papers. I had been served. I had never felt so empty in my life. Our divorce hearing was set for May 12th. This was my last chance. I had made up my mind. Ethan was going to hear me out, even if it meant confessing everything in front of the whole courtroom, even if it meant risking deportation, even if it meant going to jail. Because at this point, I just didn't care anymore. I had already lost everything. I had nothing left to lose. I sat in the courtroom, my hands shaking as I waited for Ethan to arrive. I hadn't seen him in weeks. He had been avoiding me, refusing to speak to me directly. I understood why. I had lied to him for years, but I couldn't let it end like this. I had to tell him the truth face to face, even if he never forgave me, even if he still wanted a divorce, even if he hated me. I just needed him to know. I loved him. I had loved him for years, and I had no idea how to make him believe that now. The judge entered and we all stood. Then Ethan walked in. I felt like my heart was going to explode. He wouldn't even look at me. His face was cold, unreadable. It was like I was a stranger to him now. That hurt more than anything. The judge started reading through the legal proceedings, but I barely heard a word. I could feel my chest tightening. This was really happening. We were about to end 22 years of marriage, and I hadn't even gotten the chance to say what I needed to say. I had to do something. I had to speak up. Now, I suddenly stood up. Your Honor, I would like to be sworn in and allowed to address the court. The judge raised an eyebrow. Ethan looked at me for the first time since we arrived. I saw the shock in his eyes. I saw the anger too, but I didn't care. I had to tell the truth. The judge hesitated for a moment, then nodded. You may proceed. I took a deep breath as I was sworn in. I turned to look directly at Ethan. And then, I started talking. Your Honor, the reason we are here today is because my husband does not believe that I love him. The truth is, I love him with all my heart, and I have for many years. Ethan's eyes narrowed. I saw his jaw clench. He didn't believe me. Couldn't blame him, so I kept going. I understand why he doesn't trust me anymore. Because I lied to him when we first got married. I heard people in the courtroom murmuring. Ethan's lawyer leaned over and whispered something to him. But Ethan didn't look away from me. I said I wanted children, yet I was secretly taking birth control behind his back. I know that he probably thinks I got pregnant by accident. But that's not true. Our daughter, Elena, and our son, Caleb, were not mistakes. I felt the tears rising, but I pushed them back. I had to stay strong. I stopped taking birth control on purpose. Because I wanted to have children with my husband. I wanted a family with him. Ethan's expression shifted. For the first time, I saw something other than anger in his eyes. I saw confusion. Maybe even hope? I swallowed hard and kept talking. I have signed a release with my physician that allows Ethan access to all of my medical records. My doctor is now authorized to answer any questions he has about my past medical history. The courtroom fell silent. Ethan looked stunned. His lawyer leaned over again, whispering urgently. But Ethan ignored him. His eyes were locked on me. I wasn't done yet. I had one last thing to say. And this part terrified me. I took a shaky breath. The thing is, Your Honor, my lies actually started before we were married. Ethan's body stiffened. I saw his fists clench on the table. I could feel the tension in the room. But I had to finish this. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For weeks, I had been filled with nothing but rage and betrayal. I had shut Maya out completely. I had been so certain that I knew everything about what she had done. But now, I wasn't so sure anymore. I sat there, speechless, as she confessed to the entire courtroom. I saw the way she was shaking. I saw the way her voice cracked when she talked about our children. And then, I heard the words that changed everything. Ethan, I never meant to fall in love with you. My heart stopped. Maya's voice dropped to almost a whisper. When I married you, it was for my own selfish reasons. I was afraid of being deported. I used you. I manipulated you. And for that, I will never forgive myself. She took a deep breath, looking straight into my eyes. But somewhere along the way, you became my world. I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. You took care of me when I was sick. You showed me love when I didn't deserve it. You gave me 2 beautiful children. And before I even realized it, I loved you more than anything in this world. I heard someone in the courtroom sniffle. Was it me? Maya wiped a tear from her cheek. I know that I don't deserve forgiveness. I know that I don't deserve you. She took a deep breath. But Ethan, if there's even the smallest part of you that still loves me, please don't let this be the end. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Caldwell, do you wish to proceed with the divorce? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. I looked at Maya, the woman who had lied to me, the woman who had used me, the woman who had given me everything. I didn't know what to say. Then, before I even realized what I was doing, I said the words that shocked everyone in the room. I want to withdraw my petition for divorce. Maya gasped. The judge looked stunned. My lawyer practically had a heart attack. But I didn't care. Because, despite everything, I still loved her. I always had. And maybe, just maybe, we still had a chance. The moment I said those words, I want to withdraw my petition for divorce. The entire courtroom froze. Maya's eyes widened, tears streaming down her face. Her lips parted, but she couldn't even speak. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Caldwell, are you absolutely certain? This is highly irregular. My lawyer was already leaning in, whispering frantically in my ear. Ethan, think about this. You have every legal right to walk away. She deceived you for years. You don't owe her anything. But I wasn't listening. My eyes were locked on Maya, the woman I had loved for decades, the woman who had betrayed me, but also the mother of my children, the woman who had stood there, in front of a packed courtroom, and confessed everything, knowing that it could have ruined her life. She had risked deportation. She had risked losing everything, just to tell me the truth. couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not like this. I turned back to the judge. Yes, Your Honor. I am certain. A long pause. Then, finally, the judge nodded. Very well. The petition for divorce is withdrawn. Court is dismissed. The gavel slammed down. The case was over. The second the judge left the bench, Maya rushed toward me. I didn't stop her. She hesitated, searching my face, her hands trembling. Then her voice broke. Before she could even finish, I pulled her into my arms. She let out a shaky sob, her body collapsing against mine. I held her tight, breathing her in, feeling the way she clung to me. I thought I lost you. Her voice was so small, so broken. I exhaled, closing my eyes. I thought I lost you too. We didn't talk much on the way back home. We were both in shock. We had spent weeks apart, not even looking at each other. And now, suddenly, we were together again. Not back to normal. Not yet. But something was different. Maya sat in the passenger seat of my car, her hands folded in her lap. She kept stealing glances at me, like she couldn't believe I was still here. Finally, I broke the silence. You really were willing to lose everything just to tell me the truth? She swallowed hard. Yes. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Even if it meant deportation? Her voice was barely a whisper. Even if it meant losing you? That hit me hard. I clenched my jaw, staring straight ahead at the road. I had spent so many nights angry, so many weeks convincing myself that she had never loved me. But now I wasn't so sure anymore. For the first time, I believed her. She had loved me, maybe not in the beginning. But now, I could see it, feel it, and I had no idea what to do with that. When we pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on. The kids were already home, waiting inside with my parents. Maya took a deep breath, gripping the door handle. They don't know anything, do they? I shook my head. No, just that we were figuring things out. Her fingers tightened on the handle. I don't want them to see me cry. I looked over at her. Her cheeks were still damp, her eyes puffy and red. She looked exhausted, but also relieved. Maya, I said softly. She turned toward me. I reached over, tucking a stray piece of hair behind her ear. They don't care if you cry. They just want their mom back. Her face crumbled, and before she could start sobbing again, I gently squeezed her hand. Come inside. Let's figure this out. Together. She nodded. And for the first time in weeks, we walked through the front door side by side. After dinner, after the kids were asleep, after my parents had left, Maya and I sat in the living room. Felt strange. Like we were starting over. Like we were learning each other all over again. Maya cleared her throat. Do you really think we can fix this? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I thought about everything we had been through. The lies, the betrayal, the years of love, buried underneath it all. And finally, I looked up at her. I don't know, but I'm willing to try. She let out a breath she had been holding for so long. Then she nodded, her voice soft but certain. Me too. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Maya and I sat in our bedroom. It didn't feel the same. There was a strange distance between us, even though we were finally talking again. For years, this had been our sanctuary, a place where we had laughed, argued, made love, and shared countless moments together. Now, felt like a stranger's home. Maya hesitated by the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the hem of her sweater. She looked uncertain, like she didn't know if she belonged here anymore. I exhaled, rubbing the back of my neck. You can sleep in here. Her eyes snapped up to mine. Are you sure? I nodded, though my chest felt tight. I wasn't ready for anything more. Not yet. I still didn't fully trust her. But I also couldn't push her away. Not after everything that had happened today. Yeah, I said. You're still my wife, Maya. Her eyes softened, but she didn't say anything. She just climbed into bed on her side, the same way she always had. We lay there in silence, staring at the ceiling. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us reached out. For the first time in 22 years, we went to bed as husband and wife. But as two people still figuring out what that even meant anymore. I woke up to the smell of coffee. For a split second, I thought everything was normal. Like the last few months had just been some horrible dream, and life had gone back to how it used to be. Then I walked into the kitchen, and saw Maya standing there, pouring coffee into my favorite mug. She looked up at me hesitantly. Good morning. Her voice was soft, unsure. I rubbed my face. Morning. She handed me the cup, biting her lip. I wasn't sure if you still take it the same way. That hit me hard. Of course she knew how I liked my coffee. She had been making it for me for years. I took a sip. Perfect. Just like always. I exhaled, lowering the mug. Thanks. Her shoulders relaxed, just a little. Then, before we could say anything else, the kids ran into the kitchen. Daddy! Mommy made pancakes. Elena and Caleb were beaming, completely unaware of the weight between us. I glanced at Maya. She was staring at them, her eyes glassy, like she had missed this, like she had missed us. Cleared my throat. That's great, guys. Let's eat. We sat together at the breakfast table as a family for the first time in weeks. Felt familiar. Felt like home. But underneath it all, I knew this was just the beginning. There were still wounds that needed healing. Still trust that needed to be rebuilt. And I had no idea if we could actually do it. After breakfast, I sat on the porch, sipping my coffee. Maya walked out a few minutes later, wrapping her arms around herself against the cool morning air. She hesitated, then finally spoke. What happens now? I looked out at the yard, the place where I had played with our kids, the place where I had imagined growing old with her. I took a deep breath. We take it one day at a time. She nodded, hope flickering in her eyes. I can do that. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. A glimmer of hope. The days that followed were strange. We weren't back to normal, far from it. But we were trying. The first few mornings, Maya still woke up before me, making coffee like she always had. She didn't say much, but I noticed the way she would glance at me, searching for any sign that I still resented her. The truth? I didn't know how I felt. Some moments, I looked at her and saw the woman I fell in love with. Other moments, I looked at her and remembered the lies, the betrayal, the way she had used me in the beginning. It was a war in my head, a battle between forgiveness and doubt. And I had no idea which side was going to win. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Maya and I found ourselves alone in the living room. She was sitting at one end of the couch. I was sitting at the other. The TV was on, but neither of us were really watching. Finally, she broke the silence. Ethan, can I ask you something? I glanced at her. Yeah. She hesitated. Then, quietly, do you hate me? That question hit me hard. I sat back, rubbing my face. I could see the way her hands were gripping her sweater, her knuckles turning white. She was afraid of my answer. Finally, I sighed. No, I don't hate you. Her breath hitched, like she hadn't been expecting that. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. But I don't know if I can trust you yet. She nodded, biting her lip. I understand. We sat in silence for a long time. Then she whispered, I don't know how to fix this, Ethan. I exhaled. Me neither. And that was the truth. I had no idea how to repair what had been broken. But part of me wanted to try it out. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night and found Maya sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. She didn't notice me at first. She was lost in thought, her arms wrapped around herself. After a moment, I spoke. Can't sleep? She startled, turning toward me. Then she sighed. No. I pushed myself up onto my elbows. Something on your mind? She hesitated. Then I had a dream that you left. Her voice was so quiet, almost like she was ashamed to admit it. I stared at her. She let out a small, bitter laugh. I guess it's just, I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. I sat up fully now. What do you mean? She turned toward me, eyes full of sadness. You're still here, Ethan. But what if, one day, you wake up and realize you can't do this anymore? I didn't know how to answer that, because the truth was, I had thought about it. I had wondered if I was fighting for something that couldn't be saved. But then, I looked at her, at the woman who had been broken by her past, at the mother of my children, at the only person I had ever truly loved. I swallowed hard. I don't have all the answers, Maya, but I'm here, and I'm trying. Her lips parted slightly. Then, before I could think too much about it, I reached over and took her hand. She let out a shaky breath, her fingers curling around mine. It was the first time I had touched her since the divorce hearing. It wasn't much, but it was something. A step forward. A small crack of light in the darkness. The next morning, as I walked into the kitchen, Maya was standing by the counter, pouring coffee. She looked up at me uncertainly. I walked over, took the mug from her hands, and kissed her cheek. It was quick. barely a second long. But when I pulled back, her eyes were shining. She looked shocked. I didn't say anything. I just took my coffee and walked to the table, pretending nothing had happened. But I could feel her gaze on me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. For the next few weeks, things between Maya and me slowly started to shift. We weren't fixed. Far from it. But the distance between us was beginning to close, inch by inch. It was in the small moments. The way she would linger in the kitchen after handing me my coffee. The way our hands would accidentally brush when we sat next to each other on the couch. The way she would still wait up for me when I worked late, even though she never said anything about it. Some nights we talked. Some nights we didn't. But we were trying. And for now, that was enough. I knew Ethan was still hesitant. And I couldn't blame him. I had spent years lying to him, keeping secrets that could have torn us apart. Even though I had confessed everything, I knew it wasn't as simple as just saying, "I'm sorry." Trust had to be rebuilt. And I was willing to wait as long as it took. I wanted my husband back. I wanted my family back. One night, after dinner, Ethan and I were cleaning up the kitchen together. It was quiet. The only sound was the running water and the clinking of dishes. Then suddenly he spoke. "Maya, do you regret it?" I froze, my hands still in the sink. Slowly, I turned to face him. "Regret what?" His jaw tightened. "Marrying me." My heart nearly broke. I dried my hands and took a deep breath. "Ethan, if you had asked me that question 20 years ago, my answer might have been different." His face hardened, but I wasn't done. I stepped closer. "But if you ask me now, after everything we've been through, after everything we've built together, my answer is no." He didn't say anything, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to believe me. He just didn't know if he could. I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers through his. "I don't regret marrying you, Ethan. I only regret the way it started." His shoulders relaxed just slightly. Then he did something unexpected. He squeezed my hand back. That night, as we lay in bed, I could feel the tension in the air. Not the cold, distant tension we had grown used to. This was different. This was the kind of tension that came from two people who had been apart for too long, physically, emotionally. And I could feel it pulling us together again. I turned onto my side, facing him. "Ethan?" He let out a slow breath but didn't turn away. "Yeah." I hesitated. "Do you think we can ever get back to what we had?" For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, "I don't know." He turned to face me fully. His blue eyes locked onto mine. "But I know I want to try." I felt tears prick my eyes. I bit my lip. "Me too." There was a long pause. Then finally he reached out. Just a small touch, his fingers grazing my arm. But it was enough. Because for the first time in months, we fell asleep holding each other. The next morning, the kids noticed the change immediately. Elena and Caleb ran into the kitchen, their eyes darting between us. I was making breakfast. Ethan was standing beside me, close enough that our arms would touch every time we moved. The kids exchanged a look. Then Elena grinned. "Are you and Daddy back together?" I felt my breath catch. I glanced at Ethan. He was already looking at me. Then, to my surprise, he smiled. Not a big smile. Not one of his carefree, effortless grins. But a real one, small, hesitant, but real. He ruffled our daughter's hair. "We're working on it." She beamed, throwing her arms around his waist. Caleb followed, tackling both of us into a group hug. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. Because maybe, just maybe, we still had a chance. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. And little by little, step by step, we healed. It wasn't perfect. There were still wounds, still scars. There were nights when we lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, both afraid to be the first to reach out. There were moments when the past crept in, whispering doubts in my ear. But every time that happened, Maya was there. She didn't hide anymore. She didn't pull away. Instead, she met me head-on, proving to me over and over again that she wasn't the same woman who had married me for the wrong reasons. She was my wife, the mother of my children. And more than that, she was the love of my life. I never thought we'd make it this far. A year ago, I was ready to walk away. A year ago, I was convinced that our love had been a lie. But now, I was standing in the backyard of our home, surrounded by friends and family, staring at the woman who had changed my life. The woman I had almost lost forever. Maya stood at the end of the aisle wearing a simple white dress. She was glowing, not just because of the golden sunset behind her, but because of something deeper, something real. This time, when we stood together before our children, our loved ones and each other, it wasn't for a visa. It wasn't for a lie. It was for us, for the love we rebuilt, for the family we fought for the future we refused to let go of. She took my hands, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I squeezed her fingers, swallowing the lump in my throat. The officiant cleared his throat, smiling. Ethan and Maya, after everything you've been through, after all the battles you've fought, you've chosen each other again. Do you, Ethan Caldwell, take Maya Lynn Caldwell once more to be your lawfully wedded wife? I exhaled, my heart pounding. I had said these vows once before, but now I meant them more than ever. I do. Maya let out a small, shaky laugh, her grip tightening on my hands. The officiant turned to her. And do you, Maya Lynn Caldwell, take Ethan Caldwell again as your husband? She didn't hesitate. She didn't look away. I do. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling. And when I leaned in to kiss her, our friends and family cheered. Elena and Caleb jumped up and down, clapping and laughing. And just like that, we had our second beginning. Not a perfect one, not a fairy tale, but one we had fought for, one we had earned, one that was real. Years passed. Our children grew. Life moved forward. And through all of it, through every high and low, Maya and I held on to each other. We were never perfect. We still had arguments. We still had flaws. But we had love. And sometimes that was all you needed. One evening, long after the kids had gone to bed, I sat on the porch watching the stars. Maya came out, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and sat beside me. She reached for my hand, intertwining our fingers. Do you regret staying? She whispered. I turned to her, taking in the woman who had once been my greatest heartbreak, and had somehow become my greatest love. I brought her hand to my lips, kissing her knuckles softly. Not for a single second. She smiled. And as we sat there, watching the night sky, I knew, without a doubt, that no matter what came next, we were going to be okay, because we had chosen each other. Again. And always.